Welcome back to the Great Indian AI Podcast channel. You know, we love to just jump right into these deep dives. Today, we're going to be tackling An-Nisa.
Oh, An-Nisa.
The fourth chapter of the Quran. It's a big one.
Yeah.
176 verses.
Second longest.
Second longest. And it covers so much ground. I mean, we're talking about women's roles, family life, inheritance laws, how to interact with people. It even gets into the rules of war.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It is. So if you're interested in understanding, like, the Islamic perspective on these issues, or just curious about this pivotal chapter, stick with us because this deep dive is going to be really, really insightful. Plus, if you stay till the end, you know, we've got some really valuable takeaways for you. But before we forget, hit that like button, share this episode, leave your thoughts in the comments, and of course, subscribe to the Great Indian AI Podcast channel for more content just like this.
Yes, please do that.
All right, let's dive into An-Nisa. I'm really excited to have you here, you know, to break down this complex chapter. And I think one of the first things that jumps out at me is this classification of An-Nisa as a Medinan Surah. What does that even mean?
So that's a really important point to start with. Medinan Surahs, those are the chapters that were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in Medina, you know, after he migrated from Mecca.
Right.
And this distinction is important because it affects the content, the focus. Medinan Surahs tend to be more about, you know, practical matters, legal rulings.
So it's less about the core beliefs and more about,
Exactly.
okay, here's how to actually live.
Yeah. It's like now you have a community, so how do you build a just society? How do you deal with these complex issues that come up when you're, you know, living together?
It's like a blueprint for living as a Muslim in a community, not just as an individual, right?
That's a great way to put it.
But I'm still a little confused about this whole debate about the revelation order. Like the Wikipedia article mentions it could have been revealed much later.
Oh, yes.
Maybe even the 100th surah.
Yeah.
So how does that work? And does that change how we understand what's being said?
Okay, so this gets into some of the intricacies of Quranic studies.
Yeah.
You see the order of the surahs in the Quran. It's not necessarily the exact chronological order of when they were revealed.
It's not like page 1 is the first thing in the page.
Right, exactly. So An-Nisa is fourth, but the exact timing of its revelation is debated. Now, some scholars connect it to Surah Al-Imran, which comes before it.
Yeah.
They both deal with family issues, but An-Nisa gets into the legal specifics. It's like An-Nisa builds on the foundation of Al-Imran,
Okay.
offering more concrete rulings on family life.
So it makes sense that it would come later.
Yeah, and understanding that connection, it helps us see how ideas flow in the Quran. But even with this debate, the core teachings of An-Nisa, they're still super relevant. It's all about understanding the context, you know, what each verse is addressing.
So it's like we're detectives, right? We're piecing together clues
Yeah.
from the content, the history, everything.
Absolutely. It's all about piecing it together.
And speaking of piecing things together, the Wikipedia article mentioned different ways to, like, analyze the structure of An-Nisa.
Yeah.
What are some of those approaches?
Okay, so one way is to think of it in three sections. This is what the scholar Amin Ahsan Islahi does.
Okay.
He sees the first part focused on social reform. So that's like marriage, inheritance, orphans.
Okay.
Then the second part is about the Muslim community and its opponents. So it talks about, you know, how to interact with other groups and the dangers of hypocrisy within the community.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and then the final part kind of wraps everything up, you know, brings it all together.
A good framework.
Right. But there's another scholar, Matthias Sanizer, he has a different take. He argues that the whole surah is structured around the address to Christians.
Okay, so he's seeing it through a different lens.
Exactly.
Like a dialogue between faiths.
Precisely.
That's fascinating. It's amazing how different scholars can approach the same text and come away with these different insights, right?
It is. It's what makes studying the Quran so fascinating.
Now, the Wikipedia article also mentions this scholar, Amina Wadud, who talks about different ways of interpreting the Quran. I'm curious, especially about this holistic approach and how it might influence our understanding of An-Nisa and what it says about women.
Oh, Amina Wadud, she's brilliant.
Yeah.
She talks about three approaches: the traditional, the reactive, and the holistic. Traditional focuses on the literal meanings, the established interpretations, you know, from scholars over the centuries. Reactive seeks to challenge those interpretations, often in response to contemporary issues.
Okay.
And the holistic approach, which Wadud favors, looks at the text in its entirety.
Yeah.
It's about considering the historical context, the linguistic nuances, the overall message.
So we're not cherry-picking verses, we're looking at the big picture.
Exactly.
And this can lead to a feminist reading of An-Nisa.
Some would say so, yes.
So even though some verses might seem to address like patriarchal practices of the time, a holistic reading takes into account the historical context and the Quran's emphasis on justice and compassion.
Right. It allows us to see how An-Nisa, even while working within the existing social structures, was trying to improve the status of women.
So it's about progress, not just accepting the status quo.
Exactly.
This is really helpful. It reminds us that we can't just impose our modern values onto a text from centuries ago.
Right.
We have to understand the context, the language, the big picture.
Absolutely. And speaking of context, I think it's a good time to remind our listeners to subscribe to the Great Indian AI podcast channel.
Yes, hit that subscribe button, and while you're at it, give this episode a like and share it.
We appreciate your support.
Now let's get into some of the specific verses of An-Nisa. What are some that really jump out at you as like essential for this discussion?
Okay, so let's start with verse 4.3. This one has caused a lot of discussion and even controversy because it deals with marriage, polygamy, and this phrase, those your right hands possess.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a topic that needs careful consideration, especially
And it does.
I'm looking at the interpretations from Ibn Kathir and Al-Jalalain, and they seem to offer different perspectives. Can you walk us through them?
Sure. Ibn Kathir, he's a scholar from way back, the Mamluk era.
Okay.
He focuses on the part of the verse that instructs men to marry only one wife if they fear they can't treat multiple wives justly.
Okay.
He sees those your right hands possess as referring to female slaves.
Yeah.
So for him, it's about avoiding injustice.
Avoiding injustice, even within a system that might seem...
Exactly. It's about being fair.
What about Al-Jalalain?
They also stress fairness, but they focus more on the limit of 4 wives allowed for a Muslim man.
Okay.
And the importance of treating them all equally, especially when it comes to financial support and individual needs.
So both interpretations highlight justice,
Yes.
but they emphasize different aspects.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. It's amazing how one verse can have these layers of interpretation.
And that's just 2 interpretations. There are many more out there. This verse is complex.
This brings us to another verse that's often debated, verse 4.34. Some even call it the Quran's least egalitarian verse. I'm really struggling with the interpretations here.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
How do we reconcile the traditional views on discipline within marriage with our modern understanding of, domestic violence?
It's a challenging verse, no doubt. Verse 4.34 deals with the roles of men and women within the family. It says men are protectors and maintainers of women because Allah has given them certain advantages. It mentions how men spend their wealth to support their families. And then it goes on to talk about situations where a wife might be nushuz.
Nushuz?
A term often translated as rebellious or disobedient.
Okay.
It suggests a course of action that includes admonition, then separation in bed, and if necessary, daraba.
And that's the tricky part, right? That word daraba.
It's been translated as beat, strike, or hit, which obviously raises huge concern.
Right. It's hard to see how that fits with healthy relationships.
It is. Now, some argue that this verse condones domestic violence, which is a very serious accusation. But others insist that we have to understand daraba in its historical context and that it has a wider range of meanings.
Okay, so it's not necessarily advocating for, physical abuse.
It's debated. Some scholars argue that it could even refer to a light tab as a last resort, after all other attempts at reconciliation have failed. But it's important to emphasize that Islam condemns all forms of abuse.
Absolutely. There's no justification for violence.
None whatsoever. Treating women with respect and dignity is paramount.
That's a crucial point to remember.
It is.
This is such a complex topic.
It is.
And it's really important to be sensitive to the complexity.
Absolutely.
And you know what? While we're on this topic of sensitivity and important reminders,
Yes.
let's remind our listeners that you are tuned in to the Great Indian AI podcast channel.
We love having you here.
Hit that subscribe button.
Share with your friends.
Give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, all that good stuff.
And keep those questions coming.
All right, let's get back to An-Nisa. What else should we keep in mind as we unpack this section on marriage and family?
Well, verses 4.1516, those lay out the initial guidelines on punishment for unlawful sexual intercourse, which is known as zina in Islamic terminology.
Okay.
And the punishment, as determined by later revelations, is flogging.
Flogging.
It's important to understand, though, that Islamic jurisprudence, it evolved over time.
So we're not just looking at these verses in isolation.
No, we have to consider the broader development of Islamic law.
That makes sense.
And if you want to go even deeper into Islamic marital law, verses 4.22 to 23, they list categories of women who are forbidden for a Muslim man to marry. You can find more detailed explanations in Tafsir al-Jalalain.
Ooh, Tafsir al-Jalalain. You have to check that
It's a
out.
great resource.
So we've talked about marriage, we've talked about family, we've talked about this idea of zina and the punishment.
Right.
But An-Nisa also goes into this concept of shirk. And we see that very clearly in verse 4.48.
Yes, shirk is a major theme in this surah.
So can you explain what shirk is and why it's considered such a serious sin in Islam?
Shirk is basically associating partners with Allah. It's the opposite of Tawheed, the belief in the oneness of God.
Which is like the central tenet of Islam, right?
It's the foundation.
the foundation.
And verse 4.48, it states that Allah does not forgive shirk, but he forgives anything else for whoever he wills.
That's like the one unforgivable sin.
It's seen as a complete rejection of God's absolute sovereignty.
Even though Islam teaches that God is merciful?
Yes, but shirk is crossing a line. It's a rejection of the very core of faith.
Wow. And we see that emphasis on shirk come up again later in the surah, right?
Yes, in verse 4.116, it's a recurring theme.
But An-Nisa doesn't just warn against shirk. It also talks a lot about obedience.
Right.
Obedience to Allah, to the Prophet, and to those in authority. And that's really highlighted in verse 4.59, the obedience verse, right?
That's right. That verse commands believers to obey Allah, His Messenger, and those in authority. It also instructs them to refer disagreements to Allah and His Messenger.
So obedience is important, but it has to be grounded in the teachings of Islam.
Exactly.
We're not talking about blind obedience.
No. The verse encourages critical thinking, seeking resolution through the lens of Islamic teachings.
It's about unity, resolving things peacefully within the framework of faith.
Yes, beautifully put.
This is so insightful.
It is a rich surah.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface. But before we dive any deeper, I want to take a quick moment to remind our listeners.
Yes, please do.
Like, share, subscribe to the Great Indian AI podcast channel. Your engagement helps us spread knowledge, have these important conversations.
We appreciate your support.
Now back to An-Nisa. What other verses should we touch on before we wrap up this part of our conversation?
Let's talk about verse 4.65. It stresses referring matters to Allah and His Messenger for judgment.
Okay, what makes that verse stand out? Aside from, the importance of seeking guidance, of course.
Well, what's really fascinating is that there are different opinions about what led to its revisation.
Oh, interesting.
Some scholars link it to Zubair ibn al-Awwam.
Who's that?
He was one of the Prophet's companions. Others link it to Umar, the second caliph. It's like a little mystery.
The little historical puzzle within the surah.
Exactly.
That makes it so much more interesting.
It does. And speaking of interesting, verse 4.69 has a really beautiful interpretation.
Oh, I remember reading about that. It has something to do with the al-Bayt, right?
Yes. Jafar al-Sadiq, a prominent Shia scholar, connects this verse to the al-Bayt, the Prophet Muhammad's family, and the righteous.
Okay.
He sees it as a promise that those who obey Allah and His Messenger will be in the company of prophets, the truthful, the martyrs, and the righteous. He even suggests that the Prophet Muhammad himself is included among the prophets mentioned in the verse, and the al-Bayt represent the truthful and the martyrs, while their followers are the righteous.
Wow. That's powerful.
It is.
It emphasizes the importance of, following in the footsteps of those who embody righteousness.
Exactly.
It's a beautiful reminder that we're part of a larger lineage of believers. Okay, so we've talked about marriage, family, the foundations of belief, but An-Nisa also talks about fighting in the cause of Allah.
Yes, a very important topic and one that's often misunderstood.
How does this chapter approach such a complex issue?
It does it very carefully. Verses 4.7476 talk about fighting, but they emphasize that it should only be for protecting the oppressed, including men, women, and children. It's about resisting oppression, safeguarding the weak, even if it means engaging in conflict.
So it's not about aggression.
No, not at all.
It's about justice.
Yes. It's about protecting the vulnerable.
And we have to remember the historical context here.
Absolutely. The early Muslims faced a lot of persecution.
So these verses were guidance on how to respond in a way that stayed true to Islamic values while also protecting the community.
It's about establishing peace, not perpetuating violence.
That context is so crucial.
It is.
Now, how does this idea of hypocrisy tie into this discussion of fighting for a just cause?
That's a great question. Verses 4.8990, they address hypocrisy within the Muslim community. Okay. They talk about those who claim to be Muslim, but secretly supported the enemies of the Muslims.
Wow, that's dangerous.
It was a serious issue. And these verses, they commanded such people to either genuinely embrace the faith or to leave and join their true allies.
So it's about sincerity.
Absolutely. It's about actions matching your words.
And supporting the community when times are tough.
Yes, that's key.
That unity of action and intention?
Precisely.
This is fascinating stuff.
It is.
And you know what? Speaking of fascinating stuff and reminding people of things,
Yes.
reminder to our listener.
Please.
You're listening to the Great Indian AI podcast channel.
We're so glad you're here.
Like, share, subscribe.
That good stuff.
Keep those comments coming.
We love to hear from you.
Now, are there any other verses that you really want to highlight before we move on to the next part of our discussion?
Absolutely. There are a couple more that I think offer some really interesting insights.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Okay, so how about we look at verse 4.157. This one deals with the Islamic view on Jesus' death.
Oh, that's right. I remember this one being a bit controversial.
Yeah, it can be. See, it says that people didn't actually kill Jesus or crucify him, but it was made to appear that way.
So it directly contradicts the Christian narrative.
It does, and it goes on to say that God raised Jesus up to himself.
So that's a pretty big difference in understanding.
Huge, actually. It really highlights one of the key differences between Islam and Christianity,
Which is?
the understanding of who Jesus was. Both faiths revere him, of course.
Right.
But Muslims see Jesus as a prophet of God.
Not God himself.
Exactly, not God, not the Son of God. Just a prophet, though a very important one, born miraculously to the Virgin Mary.
Okay, so a very high position, but not divine.
That's right. Muslims believe in the absolute oneness of God, Allah, and that includes rejecting any idea of a son of God.
And this all ties into that idea of shirk that we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. Associating partners with God, including sons, is a major sin in Islam.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this distinction is even more emphasized in verse 4.171, which is where the Quran rejects the Christian concept of the Trinity.
Oh, right, the Trinity. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. A core belief in Christianity.
Right. But Islam very clearly emphasizes the oneness of God and rejects that idea. Associating anything with God is shirk, and that's a huge no-no.
So these verses, they're really drawing a line, theologically speaking.
Yeah, you could say that. They lay out the clear differences in belief between Islam and Christianity when it comes to the nature of God and the role of Jesus.
But, you know, even though there are these differences, it's important to approach these conversations with respect.
Absolutely. Understanding and respecting other faiths is crucial, even when there are disagreements.
It's about focusing on the shared values, too.
Exactly, like the reverence for prophets and the commitment to ethical living.
You know, it's interesting how An-Nisa covers so much ground. We've gone from marriage and family to these deep theological discussions.
It really is a multifaceted chapter.
It is. But I feel like we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. There are so many more verses we could talk about.
There are, like those verses on inheritance laws. That's a big topic with important implications for women and their financial security.
Yeah, verses 127 to 130, right? That's something we should definitely cover.
For sure. It's a complex system, but it's rooted in the principles of fairness and justice.
It's about ensuring everyone's taken care of.
Exactly. And let's not forget the verses that talk about female orphans, or what happens when a husband abandons his wife, or even just the importance of having peace within a marriage. These were real issues that the early Muslim community faced.
It's amazing to see how An-Nisa addresses these really practical concerns.
It does. It provides guidance on so many aspects of life.
It really does feel like a blueprint for a just and compassionate society.
You got it. And hopefully our discussion today has given you a taste of that, inspired you to learn more.
Definitely. Now, before we go any further, I want to remind our listeners to check out the resources we've mentioned in the show notes on the Great Indian AI podcast channel.
Yes, please do. Tafsir al-Jalalain and Tafsir Ibn Kathir are great places to start if you want to dive deeper.
They offer some really valuable insights into the meanings and interpretations of An-Nisa.
They do.
And of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Great Indian AI podcast channel.
We appreciate your support.
We have so much more to explore together.
We do. Now, I think it's a good time to pause and let everyone process all this information. When we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive on An-Nisa and leave you with some final thoughts.
Stay tuned to the Great Indian AI podcast channel. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Great Indian AI podcast channel. We're wrapping up our deep dive on An-Nisa, and I'm feeling like we've only just dipped our toes in.
I know, right? There's so much to explore in this chapter.
So much. But before we completely run out of time, we were talking about verse 4.69 and that fascinating story with Zubair ibn al-Awwam.
Oh, yes. That's a great one. Remember, this verse talks about the rewards for those who obey Allah and His Messenger, saying they'll be in the company of prophets, the truthful, martyrs, and the righteous.
Right, a pretty amazing promise.
It is. And some scholars believe this verse was revealed because of a dispute between Zubai and another companion.
Wait, so even the prophet's closest companions disagreed sometimes?
They did. It reminds us that even those deeply devoted to their faith can have different viewpoints.
It makes them seem more human, you know?
It does, and what's important is how they handled these disagreements. Both companions went to the Prophet Muhammad for judgment.
Seeking guidance.
Exactly. And the Prophet, guided by revelation, gave a decision that was just and fair, resolving the conflict peacefully.
That's such a powerful example.
It is. It shows us that even though disagreements happen, there's a way to deal with them respectfully. Seek guidance from those knowledgeable in Islamic teachings, and prioritize fairness and justice.
That's such a good lesson, even today.
Absolutely. And it ties back to what we talked about with the obedience verse, referring matters back to Allah and His Messenger.
Right, not letting our own opinions or egos get in the way.
Exactly. Now remember that other interpretation of verse 4.69 that we mentioned, the one by Jafar al-Sadiq.
Oh, yes. He connected it to the al-Bayt, the prophet's family.
He did. He saw it as a promise that those who follow in the footsteps of the al-Bayt and the righteous will be among the most virtuous in the hereafter.
It's a beautiful interpretation.
It is. It reminds us that lineage isn't just about blood ties.
It's about spiritual kinship, carrying on those values.
Exactly. Okay, so we've touched on a lot of themes here, but before we wrap up, we have to talk about inheritance laws.
Yes. Verses 127 to 130 lay out those rules, and I know that's a topic that generates a lot of questions.
It does, but it's important to understand that these laws are all about ensuring the well-being of the entire family.
Including women and orphans, who are often the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. It's a system designed to uphold justice and prevent anyone from being left destitute.
It's like a safety net.
Yes. And this concern for social justice, it runs throughout An-Nisa. Remember those verses about female orphans, or when a husband abandons his wife? Islam is trying to protect the rights of everyone.
Wow. AnNisa really does feel like a guidebook for building a just and compassionate society.
It does. It offers solutions to real-life problems based on Islamic principles. So much wisdom packed into one chapter.
It's been incredible exploring it with you, though I have to admit I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all the information.
It's a lot to take in, but remember, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep learning.
Yes. Pick up a copy of the Quran, check out those commentaries we mentioned, Tafsir al-Jalalain and Tafsir Ibn Kathir. Talk to people who know more than you.
That's right. Keep asking questions.
And don't forget, all those resources are linked in the show notes on the Great Indian AI podcast channel.
And while you're there, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our future deep dives.
And leave us a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions.
We do. Thank you for joining us on this journey through An-Nisa. It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, peace be upon you.